this is not something that I do very well, is just sit and talk about myself. I think nothing fun has really happened to me any more than the normal things until I get to looking back and going through my history and seeing all of the dumb fun things I did do. But I think it probably will be the easiest, and if you won't mind too much, I've written it down in longhand and I'll just read it. It'll be easier than trying to remember all these things and ending up with a lot of and uhs on the tape. I have a real memory deficiency, and so it will be simpler if I read it. First of all, I'll give you a little history of my family. My father's people were Criers and Dunns, and my mother's people were Joneses and Whitmires. All the families are among the English who settled in the Carolinas in the early 1700s, and they were in the migration down through the southern states as grants would be handed out by the government. This migration went on. And these people, it wasn't unusual to have a man or a woman born in one state and raised in another state, and then the records show that they would marry in another state and then have children in a couple of other states and die in still another state. So these people were constantly on the move. And my people all ended up in East Texas. Now for the story. I, Annie Laura Crier. On a rainy Sunday morning, January the 31st, 1930, the small sawmill town of Weirgate, Texas, had a new citizen. I was born to Lola and Floyd Crier. My father was an electrician at the sawmill. Both my parents were converts to the church about the time of their marriage. I was greeted by a very happy 4-year-old sister, Mary Helen. That was the extent of my family, my mother, my father, my sister, and I. I was always very happy and easygoing as a child, but stubborn enough to keep my mother busy, trying to guide it into useful areas. My parents were always very firm believers in strict discipline, but with such a love that I never resented it. I remember many a spanking with a willow switch or a peach tree switch, but I never doubted my parents' love for me. I've used this same willow switch principle with all my children, with one addition. I very gently asked them to go out and pick the switch that they thought fit the offense. And that's something that my children remember and laugh about to now. That was the hardest, was going out and picking the switch to fit the offense. I remember my parents teaching my sister and I that we shouldn't do this or that because good Mormons just didn't do that. There were no other Mormons within miles of where we lived, and it wasn't until I was 12 years old and we moved into a large town just before the war where there was a branch of the church that I learned good Mormons do a lot of things that I had been taught were wrong. I had a very happy childhood. Because we were Mormons, we were outcasts in the community. People were nice, but we were never allowed to mix socially or even attend other churches in town. So our little family held Sunday school in our house. My father would travel 150 miles each time he was ready for a priesthood advancement after being taught by the missionaries. After our little Sunday school and sacrament meetings, we would take a picnic lunch and walk for hours through the woods around our little town. Our parents not only taught my sister and I the names of all the trees and the flowers and the little creatures, but they taught us respect for them as being given to us by a loving Heavenly Father. And something that my children still laugh about as adults is that I don't kill things in my house. If a bee or a wasp or a spider is there, I'll catch him and with a little cup and a piece of paper and let him go outside. I can't kill these little creatures that are only doing what the Lord sent them to do. There was once that my mother was asked if I could sing with a group of Methodist children in their church at an Easter program because I could sing alto. From the time I was very small, I could harmonize well, and I still can't read music, and all I go by is what I hear in my ear. I was 4 years old, and my aunt belonged to this church, was why they even considered letting a Mormon person come in. She had a son who was just a little older than I was, and he was not singing. Okay, they sat us on the front row of the church to wait our turn. We were all in our very best bib and tucker with our Easter basket and our eggs, sitting on the front row. Well, while waiting, I promptly ate all my Easter eggs. You can't go up and sing in front of a group without your Easter basket full of eggs. So my aunt very quickly took my cousin's Easter basket and gave it to me so I would present well with this group of little kids singing. Finally, it came our turn. We stood up in a straight line in front of the congregation to sing our song. As I sang, I promptly ate all of his eggs right in front of him, and he was helpless to do anything about it, and I'm not sure he ever forgave me for that. I lived in this little sawmill town till I was 11. I remember the school, my first grade teacher, Miss Beckton, getting my tonsils out, being baptized in the creek, and practicing the song, God Bless America. And it's so strange that that should happen this week when Kate Smith died. But we practiced this song, God Bless America, to travel to this town of Beaumont to sing on the radio, only to find out when we arrived there that Kate Smith had complete personal rights to this song. It was just before the war started, and no one could sing that song on the radio but her. So we did all of that for nothing. As was the Southern custom when I was young, most every family had a Negro mammy. Now that was a word that was in my history because that was an acceptable word when this was written. Our mammy's name was Harry May. When I was in grammar school, my mother was sick a lot, and Harry May took over the management of the home, even to the managing of the money each week. Harry May had a little girl named Patty, and there's a picture in the book here of Patty, who was a year younger than me, and we played together as if we were both white, and that was at a time when that was unheard of. Down in the South where we lived, during this time, you walked down the sidewalk and the black people would step off into the street to let white people go by. And white people expected this, and this was something that my father always hated. He felt like there was no difference, and so we were taught that way. When I was 11, a few months before the war started, we moved to Beaumont, where my father went to work at a big shipyard. While I'm thinking about it, and for the interest of my future generations, I've been called Bonnie all my life. It isn't part of my name, and I have no idea when it started. There was a song called Bonnie Annie Lara, so maybe my mother was singing for joy when I was born. And the Bonnie was picked up and stuck. I keep wandering from my story here. One fun thing I remember, on the coast where we lived, it rained hard, suddenly, and often. This particular morning, it started raining about 6 o'clock. I left home to walk to junior high school at 8. When I started out, I had to carry my shoes because so many places along the streets the water was already up to my knees. The weather and the water were warm, so I didn't mind. By the time classes started, the water was flowing like a river through the halls of the school. School was dismissed for 2 days, one for the water to go down and another one to just shovel out the mess, and it was a real fun time for the students. This was not an uncommon occurrence in Beaumont. I can remember so many pleasant things about the wartime years. I was really too young to be much involved in the war except buying saving stamps and making war effort posters. But I can remember when margarine was invented. Do you remember when margarine was invented? It was glorified shortening that you put a yellow capsule in and beat up. And I also remember when detergent was invented. It was rubber. Rubber could not be gotten because the Japanese had these islands where all their raw rubber was, and they started making synthetic rubber, and detergent was a byproduct, and my sister was a chemist at a synthetic rubber plant at Firestone, And she would bring home these little brown paper sacks of this funny-looking stuff that was sudsy, and it was supposed to be good for your clothes. And my mother was very suspicious of this stuff because it just didn't look like soap, and she couldn't feature it getting the clothes clean. During the years we lived in Beaumont, we attended a small branch of the church that met in a large Woodman of the World lodge hall, and we met upstairs. On Sunday mornings, after Saturday night parties in the big lodge hall, the big hall was always cluttered with cigar stubs and ashes and beer and whiskey bottles. And that's something, when I went over this in my journal, where it said bottles, that struck me as things weren't put in cans. That was before the time of things being in cans. Everything was in bottles. We had to clean off the chairs and a section of the floor before we could hold Sunday school meetings. I started teaching Sunday school class when I was 15, and I had children ranging from the ages of 2 to 13. My father was branch president there for about 6 years. In 1944, my family, my father, mother, sister, and I, went on the train to Mesa, Arizona to be sealed in the temple. This was a very difficult thing because it was during the war still, and those of you who ever traveled by train remember how difficult it was to get reservations, and you would have a reservation and could at any moment have it canceled because of troop movement all across the country. And even the servicemen coming home on leave had priority over anyone for train seats. But for some reason we lucked out and were able to go. One very important experience that I had while we lived in Beaumont will remain very clear in my memory. This particular Sunday there were only 7 people that came to Sunday school. We were very discouraged and talked of going home and just giving up. The hall we met in was huge, but we had about 30 folding chairs up at the far end of the hall. Well, as we were about to give up and leave, we all heard this door open at the back of the hall, and people file in. It was upstairs, and every board creaked as you walked across it, and people filed in, and you could hear the boards creak in front of every one of these 20-odd chairs as if people were coming in and sitting down. And yet we couldn't see anyone, and needless to say, we held our Sunday school to a full house. Strengthening factor to my testimony, I was 15 when this happened. I've thought for years that maybe I exaggerated it in my memory, thinking back of it being something very important to me. But one trip home when I visited with my sister, I was going through her journal entries to clear up some gaps in mine, and she had recorded the same incident, and it was just as I had remembered it. In 1946, my whole life took on new meaning. That was when I met the most wonderful man that ever was or ever would be. We had to travel about 100 miles to Houston to district conference. This was just after the war ended. During the meeting, one lone elder sat on the stand with the mission president. He was the first male missionary to be sent out after the war. He was gorgeous. I nudged my mother and said, "I'm going to marry that missionary." That same year, my parents moved to another town, but allowed me to move into the YWCA so I could finish high school with my class. And that's an entirely fun story, too, being away from my family and out on my own when I was 16, doing my own cooking and laundry. And how many of you know what the YWCA is? It's the female YMCA. And it was a Christian organization, and we were very well chaperoned. And it was just really a fun time. Also, my courtship with Elder Gividen, as he was called down there, and his proposal and our engagement was a fascinating, funny story. We courted by mail. he would come to our little branch for different meetings, which he somehow managed to decide needed to be held. But he would always sit way over there, and I would sit over here. And anyway, we went to another district conference, and the mission president said I was wanted on the phone in the housekeeper's room. She had a phone, and I always slept with her when I'd go into conference. And I found out later that Harold had gone upstairs to the mission president's office on the phone, and he called over the phone downstairs to see if I would marry him. And he didn't ask if I would marry him. He just asked if I thought I would like to live in the mountains. And I said, yes, well, sure. And so that was the way it was all settled. And I opened the door to come out, and here was the mission president with his ear against the door. And all of these lady missionaries and elders and well, what did you say? And come to find out, everybody knew it was going to happen but me. And so it was, and our wedding and our honeymoon was a real nifty story. He came home from his mission. He was given permission to ask me to marry him. Then he came home and had to go back and get me in a couple of weeks. And my mother and my aunt came out here with us. And we were married without ever having a date before we married. We came out here. In fact, we were never alone, because when he went to get me, my people were busy saying goodbye. When we got here, his people were busy saying hello. And we were married about 3 days after we got here. And then we went on our honeymoon. My mother and my aunt went with us because we had to take them back home. And it was something that I wouldn't recommend to my daughters, but it kind of had a happy ending. Needless to say, we did get married September the 28th, 1948. I was 18 and he was 23, and we were married in the Salt Lake Temple. We started our married life in 2 little rooms in the house of Mrs. Carrick that was between Dad's garage and Welby Warren's house. That's a field now, but there used to be a little house there. There was no water and no bathroom, and it was heated by a monstrous coal-eating dragon, which I also had to cook on. I felt like a pioneer woman, and I loved it. When I came to Mapleton, there was one ward, and Oscar Whiting was my bishop. You all remember Oscar Whiting, Patriarch Whiting. Maternity entries. I had one miscarriage that first year in 1949 that just emotionally wiped me out. Then Chuck was born in 1951, Julie in 1953, Floyd Thomas was born in 1955 and died 1 month later. Peggy was born in 1957, Becky in 1959, Amy in 1963, and Norman in 1965. One very special experience concerning Floyd. He was named after my father. My father never had any sons, and that line died out when he died. So we named this child after him. We knew that he was in trouble when he was born. After everything else failed, what he had was a lung problem. His lungs wouldn't open. Now they can fix that very simply, but they couldn't then. So we moved him to the LDS hospital in Salt Lake. After several days, he seemed to be improving, and the doctor encouraged us to go home and tend to our other children. A day and a half later, the baby worsened and died suddenly. We rushed to Salt Lake in the dead of night. While Harold filled out the forms and signed the papers, the nurse took me to the baby's room. All the tubes and the equipment had been removed. When I started into the room, I was enveloped by a feeling as real as arms around me. I was completely at peace. I walked over to the bed and picked up that tiny form and felt absolutely nothing. And I knew that the baby had waited for me to get there to say goodbye. And it was an experience that made our grief very quiet and very sweet and very short, because we knew that he was always with us. All right, that's the end of the tears. Through the years, we've made many trips to East Texas to visit my family. Each trip a chapter in itself, filled with memories and bonding. One experience that the older children will never forget. My family lived out on a farm of dense piney woods. One night, my father was a little short, dynamic man, but gentle, and my tears come from him. But he was branch president, and such a spiritual man is what makes the story so funny. They remember him as being a very dignified man. Okay, this night, he kept dogs on his farm because they kept the little creatures run away, you know, like snakes and armadillos and coons and things. They kept them scared away. This night, 2 of his dogs began to bark. So Grandpa jumped out of bed, put on his bathrobe and his high-topped rubber boots because of the snakes, on over his long-handled underwear, which he slept in. He took his gun and he went out to see what the dogs had treed. He shot a time or 2, and by then the household was awakened up. When he returned, he was carrying a huge raccoon by the tail. What a picture. There stood my father, bathrobe, knee boots, long johns and all, raccoon in one hand, gun in the other, and a smile as big as all outdoors. And he said, "Now my girls will sleep tonight." He was talking about his fat-laying hens, because that's what the coons were after. 37 years of married life have been very good, and I wouldn't change a single year of it. Things that I enjoy are sewing and crafts and my yard and flowers and my grandchildren and organizing my house. I'm a funny person, but you ask me for anything and I know right where it is. I just like that. Certain types of art, creative writing, my grandchildren singing in the choir and teaching, and I really love acting, and my grandchildren and walking, and the Christmas season and going to church and my grandchildren. And that gorgeous blonde elder is still gorgeous. And the funny part about it all is he still thinks I'm gorgeous. And there isn't a thing in that 37 years that I would change. And what makes it all so special is being here with you, friends. 37 years worth of friends. The end.